I'm going to lift the tone a bit and talk about taxes. So as we've seen this morning, the three main political parties are committed to further fiscal consolidation over the next Parliament, although that's in varying degrees. To date, none has proposed significant net tax increases, but to limit the size of the implied cuts to public services or to benefits and the difficult decisions they'd entail, some of which you just heard, it would not be surprising were the next government to in fact raise taxes. This would be even less surprising given what we know about taxes and the electoral cycle, some of what was hinted at earlier. This chart shows the net tax announcements made in each fiscal event, so that's budgets, pre-budget report and autumn statement, since the mid-1980s. And what the eagle-eyed amongst you might be able to spot is that there's a certain pattern to these announcements. I was going to play a game, Who Can Spot the Elections, but Carl's somewhat given that away by telling you what happened with tax rises. But showing elections with these dotted yellow lines, we can see that tax increases have tended to follow after elections, strikingly so. Indeed, within 12 months of every general election since 1992, the newly elected government has announced tax increases equivalent to at least £5 billion in today's terms. Make of that what you will. So, for the next 10 to 15 minutes or so, I'm going to outline some options a future government could consider were it to follow this well-worn path and announce tax increases after the May 2015 general election. I'm going to consider these options in three broad groups. Firstly, increasing broad-based taxes. Secondly, increasing taxes on the rich. And third, scaling back tax release and exemptions. As my colleague Andy noted in relation to benefit expenditure, we don't take a stance on which, if any, tax rises would be appropriate. And all we do is we merely point to some options that do exist, should the next government decide to increase taxes. And I'm also going to talk about what the effect of these increases would be. There's also, however, a number of options which should be avoided regardless of whatever government comes to power. These are just poorly designed ways to raise revenue, and I'll mention them at the end. But taking a step back, first of all, and looking at the current composition of government revenues, just three big taxes, income tax, national insurance contributions and VAT, already account for 60% of government revenues. Adding in another four taxes to the mix, it takes that to over 75%. And then there's some other taxes which make up the remainder. So a small increase in these big taxes could raise substantial further sums. Looking firstly at just the big three taxes, a 1 percentage point increase in all rates of income tax, in all employee and self-employed rates of NICs, or in the main rate of VAT, would each raise around £5 billion. Coincidentally, that's about the same amount as the smallest of the post-election tax increases that we've seen and that I showed you earlier. However, while recent governments, including the current coalition government, have increased the rates of VAT and NICs, neither the basic nor higher rate of income tax has been increased for a long time, since 1975 in fact. This figure is the standard IFS Decile Chart and illustrates the distributional impact each of these tax increases would have. What we do here is we divide households into 10 equal-sized groups according to income, from lowest income on the left to highest income on the right. And then we can look at the losses that will be experienced by each of these groups as a percentage of income. We can see from the first bar, this blue bar, that revenue from increasing the basic rate, of income tax will be strongly progressive, with the largest losses concentrated among the higher income households, even as a percentage of income. Revenue from increasing the higher rate of income tax, or the additional rate of income tax, comes overwhelmingly from the highest income tenth of the population, and altogether these income tax increases would raise £5.5 billion. More than three-quarters of that, however, comes from increasing the basic rate of income tax. So it's important to note that the big tax increase that you could do in terms of 1 percentage point increases is on the basic rate rather than the additional or the higher. Raising employee and self-employed rates of NICs is also strongly progressive, with the largest losses experienced by the highest income households. However, a notable difference not shown on this chart would be the effect by family type. Pension earnings are not liable to NICs, and so they would not be affected by such an increase, but they would were one to increase income tax. Less straightforward, however, is the distributional impact of increasing the main rate of VAT. What this kind of creamish bar here shows is that as a percentage of income, this measure looks regressive. However, this impression is misleading. Low-income households often spend a lot relative to their income, and so therefore pay a lot of VAT or of any increase to VAT. But households can't spend a high proportion or more than their income indefinitely. And typically many of those who are doing so are experiencing temporary periods of low income and just running down their savings in order to maintain consumption levels. We can get a more accurate representation of the distributional impact of this measure by looking at losses as percentage of expenditure rather than income, and that's shown by the orange bar here. And on this basis, increasing the main rate of VAT is slightly progressive, with the losses in the highest income households slightly larger than those in the lowest income households, and indeed anywhere else in that distribution. And this is because households who are poor over a lifetime, and so therefore say have low and would lose a small proportion as amount of expenditure from this measure, tend to spend a greater proportion of their spending on domestic heat and fuel and things like that, which are not subject to the main rate of VAT. In addition to distributional effects, each of these reforms would weaken work incentives by reducing the value of any additional earnings after tax. They'd also exacerbate other tax-induced economic distortions. In the case of raising rates of income tax, it would increase this disincentive to save in taxed forms, that is, in anything other than an ISA, a pension or a main home. Raising rates of NICs would increase the incentive to shift the form in which income is taken, away from earnings and towards capital income, for example as dividends. Increasing the main rate of VAT would increase the distortion in consumption patterns towards buying zero and reduced rated goods. Now, instead of, or in addition to increasing the rates of these broad-based taxes, one could also adjust the thresholds at which they apply. Most income tax and NICs thresholds, for example, rise in line with inflation, but freezing these for the first 2 years of the next Parliament would raise about £3.7 billion, or about £10 billion if you extended that freeze over the full term of the next Parliament. This would partly undo some of the Coalition's increases to the personal allowance, but would be in the same direction as what the Coalition has done to the higher rate threshold, which is to reduce it. Looking next at corporation tax, which is the next biggest revenue raiser, a 1 percentage point increase in this would raise only £1.5 billion, much less than the other big taxes. This is partly because the tax base, corporate profits, are very internationally mobile, and that limits the potential revenue on offer. Increasing the rate of corporation tax would also discourage investment and would increase the bias for companies to finance any investment through debt issue rather than equity. Council tax, business rates and fuel duties each raise a little over £25 billion per year, so increasing any of these by 10% would raise around £2.5 billion in a year. Each of these increases would have their own pros and cons, but any increase would be going against the recent trend of policy, which has been to cut these rates along with corporation tax, which has fallen from 28% to 20% over the course of this Parliament. Each political party has pledged their support for declarations to the effect that those with the broadest shoulders should bear the greatest burden of the fiscal consolidation. So a future government which decided to raise taxes might want to look at increasing taxes on the well-off. When considering such increases, though, it's worth bearing two things in mind. Firstly, we're already quite reliant on a large number, on a very small number even, of individuals for a large share of tax revenues. And this, of course, reflects the unequal distribution of resources, as well as the progressivity of the tax system. Second, the highest income households have already seen the largest tax increases over the fiscal consolidation to date. The next government could decide to further increase this contribution, and if it did, the most obvious measures to look at would be increasing the rates of income tax, national insurance contributions or capital gains tax on individuals with high income. Or indeed, one could change the thresholds at which these rates apply, extending the band of income of which higher rates do apply and therefore raising revenue. However, increasing these rates would affect a small number of individuals who tend to be quite responsive to tax increases, and that again would reduce the scope for substantial revenues. Although there's lots of uncertainty, the government's best guess is that a 1 percentage point increase in the additional rate of income tax, that's the 45p rate to me and you, would raise only £100 million compared to 4.2 billion from a 1 percentage point increase in the basic rate of income tax. So again, just to give you an idea of the size of revenues on offer from these measures. Less than 5% of deaths currently give rise to inheritance tax, and as written on the roof, many of those inheriting a home of unfading splendour. However, that could be increased, and despite long-standing Conservative Party ambition to reduce inheritance tax, the Coalition has actually increased inheritance tax over this Parliament. It's done that by freezing the threshold above which bequests are taxed at £325,000. By 2017, that will represent a real terms cut of £65,000. Future government, as I've said, could raise more from an inheritance tax and could do that by reducing this threshold in nominal terms or by increasing the rate at which bequests are taxed. And one can make a case whether or not inheritance tax should exist or not, and there's strong opinions either side, but it's unclear why, if bequests at death ought to be taxed, gifts throughout life should escape similar treatment. A future government might also look at extending inheritance tax to gifts throughout life. The Coalition have twice targeted those with large pension pots by reducing annual and lifetime limits on pension contributions, and the future government could do likewise. However, rather than preventing individuals from saving in a pension once that pension pot reaches a certain size, it would be far better to directly reduce the generosity of subsidies to pension saving. Firstly, one could reduce the large tax-free lump sum that exists when people draw down their pension, and second, one could remove the exemption of employer pension contributions from national insurance contributions. Employer pension contributions are currently the only major form of employee remuneration which has escaped NICs entirely, and one could change that, raising substantial revenues. There's been a lot of discussion of proposal to introduce a mansion tax. At present, council tax bills are set at a lower proportion of value for more valuable properties, and so there is a strong case for taxing higher value properties more heavily. But introducing a new mansion tax is an unnecessarily complicated way to do this. One could achieve the same effect through a long overdue reform to council tax, for example, making bills proportional to current rather than 1991 values as present. Most taxes include a range of reliefs and exemptions, which often distort behaviour and almost invariably complicate the tax system. That's not to say all tax relief should be abolished. There might be justifiable reasons for many of them. And we discussed a number of options for scaling back tax reliefs in our chapter. I haven't got time to go through them all now, but in detail, but I'll just mention one or two things about a few of them. Firstly, as was noted earlier on, there's lots of goods subject to zero and reduced rates of VAT. Extending the main rate of VAT to these goods could raise up to £39 billion before any compensation package, but would be an extremely radical, not to mention controversial move. One could take smaller steps along this path, however, and reduce the bias that exists in consumption patterns towards zero and reduced rate goods by, for example, increasing the zero rate to 5% or by charging the standard rate on domestic fuel. The zero rating of domestic fuel has currently very negative environmental consequences, which one might also want to address through such a measure. I've already talked about scaling back subsidies to pension saving, and one could also reduce the number of exemptions that exist for capital gains tax. Applying a reduced rate of capital gains tax to owner-managed businesses seems an expensive and poorly designed way to encourage entrepreneurship, and while it's hard to see why capital gains unrealised at death should be forgiven and written off. Widening the inheritance tax net to remove some hard-to-justify exemptions for unquoted business assets and agricultural land would together raise a little over £1 billion, while extending inheritance tax before 7 years before death would be a step towards the kind of lifetime transfer tax that I mentioned earlier on. There's a number of reliefs for business rates, which for low-value properties, empty properties and agricultural properties, and one could abolish these, raising significant sums. And another place to look at might be applying the NICs regime for employees to the self-employed. The self-employed are presently taxed a lot less heavily than employees, but they're typically taxed more heavily than companies. One might ideally want to align tax rates across all these forms, but if you're just going to look at changing rates of tax on the self-employed, there's an obvious tension there. If you increase the rates of tax on self-employed, you bring them more into line with employees, but more out of line with companies. Single adult households currently receive a 25% council tax discount, and this leads single households to occupy larger properties and other households smaller properties than they otherwise would. And one could abolish this discount, raising £1.4 billion, and one could also abolish the transferable allowance for married couples due to come in April, as has been proposed by the Labour Party. Now, while the best tax increases to pursue depends on the government's distributional goals and indeed their wider priorities, there are some measures which should just be avoided. The first of these is increases to stamp duty land tax, which is currently levied on the sale of residential and non-residential properties. And this has been repeatedly used as a revenue raiser by the current and previous governments. SDLT is an extremely distortionary tax. It's a basic tenet of economics that transactions should not be taxed, and there's no reason that one can think of why a property should be taxed more heavily just because it changes hands more often. This tax has the effect of discouraging mutually beneficial transactions, for example, preventing some families from moving homes when their circumstances change. A second option would be to restrict pensions tax relief a second option to avoid even would be to restrict pensions tax relief to the basic rate. This suggestion is fundamentally misguided. It ignores the fact that pension contributions are tax exempt as the pension income that they fund is taxed upon receipt. The tax is in essence deferred from when the contributions are made to when the pension income is drawn down. And it's hard to see why, if higher rate relief on pension contributions is wrong, higher rate tax on pension income is okay. It would be much better to reduce the generosity of genuine subsidies to pension saving that I've already mentioned, if one wanted to target those with large pensions. So to conclude, given recent history, it would not be surprising were the next government to raise taxes after next general election. I don't know has that point been made to date so far. We discussed a number of options in the chapter that a future government might consider, from broad-based tax increases to tax increases focused on the better off, and also removing or reducing some of the many reliefs and exemptions that exist in the system. There'll no doubt be, there's some options that should just be avoided, and I've just mentioned two of those, although there are many more. Whatever does happen after the general election, there's going to be a lot of attention given to whether the government increases taxes and by how much. But it also matters how they do it, both in terms of who bears the burden of any tax increase and the effect of any tax increases on the economy. And I hope we've given you a flavour of what the consequences of some of the tax increases that might be considered on both of these dimensions. Thanks very much.